In the last lecture, you heard a couple of stories, and one of them is a little folktale I like to tell about George Buchanan. But did you know that the reason that I connect with that story isn't because it's a clever folktale? And it isn't because I think that I can get a laugh with all of the characters that I get into. I connect with that story most because of the countercultural message that that story conveys about rural folk like me. I'm from the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee, and that story tells me that folk like me may come from the backwoods, but we're pretty clever all the same. That's the real reason why I tell that simple folk tale. And that's what I'm thinking about when I tell that story to kids in Appalachia, that the folks who live outside of these mountains may hear your accent and they may think you're dumb. But don't let that worry you. You're smart. You're clever. You could be the king's man. When you start to look more deeply at the stories you tell and ask why you tell those stories, why you connect with those stories, you'll be surprised how many deeper layers of meaning your everyday stories hold, and what these stories say to you at a deeper level that makes them stick with you. Now, clearly there are lots of different kinds of stories that we tell. Folk tales like this one, or tall tales like Bill Lepp's moose tipping story, or family stories like the story about my grandfather's hands, or my great Aunt May, the old maid. In this lecture, we'll talk about how you personally connect with stories and the genres of stories that are available to you, as well as the underlying reasons how and why we tell the stories that we choose to tell. The personal connection that you have with your story is perhaps the most important relationship in this storyteller-audience story triangle. The amount of interest and time that you take with a story will certainly vary. Your relationship with a quick anecdote that you tell will be different than your relationship with other stories that are more meaningful to you. But no matter how much time you take in preparation, in the moment of telling, you have to care about that story. Now, I found several stories about George Buchanan. The story that you heard in the last lecture is one of the many stories about this figure in Scottish and Appalachian folktale. George is what's called a trickster character, like Brer Rabbit. He gets in and out of mischief. So let's take this story back to the storytelling triangle. I was drawn to this story partly because of what it means to be culturally and as an Appalachian woman. Now, this is your social and cultural connection with the story. My region of the country is steeped in Scottish cultural heritage. Now, our family actually married into a clan of Buchanans, and those Buchanans were living there in southwestern Virginia because of their cultural history, having to flee Scotland after being kicked out by Bonnie Prince Charlie and then being driven to Ireland. And then, during the potato famine, these Scots-Irish nomads settled in the mountains of Appalachia. And in every place, they were almost always looked down on as being of a lesser class and caste than the more affluent English. Now here, the hillbillies they became were, and still are, looked down on as being ignorant and backward. But most folks in Appalachia know they're smart. Like George Buchanan, they know they're clever, and they sometimes may put on that they're not as smart as they actually are so they can have a bit of fun with the knights and the upper castes of contemporary society. So I'm drawn to this story as an Appalachian woman. And then there's this Scottish cultural heritage of my region that presses these particular stories back towards me. And being an Appalachian American in a region with a strong Scottish heritage, there's a physical connection that I have with the story. Where you're physically located affects how and if you see something. Now, I've been to Scotland several times, so I've gained a perspective on that place and I've gotten to know the people there. But I'm not a Scottish person. And that affects how I tell the story, because I'm using the accent not the whole time, but only when the characters speak. And I took some dialect lessons to try and make my pronunciations as accurate as I could, so that the accent isn't mocking up a culture, but it's one of a number of cultural details that point my audience back to that cultural location. I have an emotional connection with the story. I care about what happens to the characters and what happens to George. I treat him as though he's a real person and not a two-dimensional character. Your emotional connection with your story will be based on how you identify with the story or not. There may be stories that you have a strong negative emotional reaction to. Now, I also have an intellectual connection to that story. I'm intellectually challenged by the story. The riddles, for example, are delightful to me. But this intellectual connection also means that I've looked deeper into all that the story has to offer. And this intellectual connection will vary depending on how much time you want to spend with your story. For an impromptu story that just occurs to you from personal experience or recounting a story that you've heard, you may have one level of emotional connection. But for other stories, you want a deeper connection. So you spend time getting to know the characters and the plot line and the cultural context. And you consider the metaphorical resonances of the story, the connections to Appalachians, for example. And you may read different versions of the story, learning from the cultural context from multiple sources. The goal of seeking multiple sources applies whether you're telling a folk tale or a personal story or any story. Even if the story you want to tell is an event that happened to you, it's very useful to do some research to flesh out the story for a wider audience. Because for one, when you seek out multiple sources, you're fact-checking. You're making sure that the story is right, that you get it right, so you're not embarrassed if somebody contradicts you and comes out with the accurate details of the story later. So it's always good to triangulate your research, to look for at least 3 sources. And you can even do this with family stories, though there are some family stories that just sound great and are worth telling, even if you're not sure if they're true or not. Many of the stories I tell are based on oral histories that I've collected. My PhD training is in the methods and ethics of reperforming oral history-based stories. And most recently, I've been studying the stories of a community of coal miners. Most of them are disabled, and they live in southwestern Virginia. Now, here's one of their stories. But I come from coal country, and I know we're officially in Virginia right now, but I wanted to tell a story about more my end. We actually have a farm that straddles the Tennessee-Virginia border. So we have our house in Tennessee, and then you walk about 10 feet off our porch and you're in Virginia. But you're in the southwestern part of Virginia in the mountains. And there are a lot of miners who live there. It's coal country. And for my PhD training, it's in something called performance ethnography. It's one of those wonderful multi-syllabic terms that makes you sound very smart. But what it means is that I interview people, and then I take those stories, and with those people's permission, I retell those stories to wider audiences. And usually I'm seeking out those stories that don't often get heard in the wider public. And so for the past several years, I've been getting to know a community of coal miners in southwestern Virginia, and I'd like to share one of their stories with you today. And you should know that this is a contemporary story. All the things that you'll hear are happening right now. Okay, this isn't just way back when. All of this, it's a contemporary story. And I have the miners' permission to tell the story. And you need to know that all of these events actually did happen to one man named Donzel. Isn't that a great name? Can you say that name with me? Donzel. It's great. All of this happened to one man named Donzel, and I learned Donzel's the one person who I didn't actually interview myself. His story came to me from a mining training video that the Mining Safety and Health Administration did. It's in public domain, and he wanted his story out there in the public. So it all happened to this one man named Donzel, but the person who narrates this story, it's a composite character, a composite narrator that I created based on these 20-some miners who I interviewed myself. And all of them have given their permission for their story to be heard. And the way that this person, this composite character, the way this person tells a story, yeah, I was in the mines. Now, I was just a red hat when this happened. I just started mining. But my friend, Donzel, He'd been in there a little bit longer than me. He was still new, but he kind of took me under his wing. He taught me a thing or two about mining. Now at the time that this happened, we had just blasted and timbered in a new room. Now, timbers are wooden supports you put up to support your roof up above you, 300 feet of mountain up above your head. We just blasted and timbered, and I went in that room before anybody else got in there, and I switched off my cap light. It was so dark. You ain't never seen anything that dark before. It was pitch black. I turned that light back on, and once my eyes adjusted from coming from the dark up into the light, I thought I saw what looked like an outline of ferns all along that wall. Only they couldn't have been ferns, because I seen them little bitty plants out on my mama's front porch, and no, these things was huge. 16-foot-long arms and leaves this big. Well, I went over to it. I had to see if it was real, and I took out my knife, that butt end of my knife, and I put my hand up there. I tapped that knife up, and a little piece of that fossil come off in my hand. That fossil, millions of years old, I found out. It's dark and hard against that great coal. Well, I could hear the others coming, and I didn't want them to see me so fascinated with this piece of rock, so I unzipped my jacket, and I put that into my jacket, and the others come, and we set to work. Donzel, he was with them. And Donzel, he run that continuous miner machine. It's a long, low-to-the-ground machine. It's got a rotor on the front of it with carbon steel teeth. And what you do is you run it with a remote. So we turn that remote on, and that rotor, it would start to spinning. And that rotor, as it spun, those carbon steel teeth, they would dig into that face of coal. They'd dig out that coal, and they deposit it onto a belt. And that belt, it run from all the way where we were, 3 miles dug into the mountain. It run 3 miles out to the entrance. And once it got out of that entrance, that coal on that belt, it would tip up on that belt as it arced up into the sky, and then that coal, it would spill off over the tipple and into trucks that were waiting to take that coal off to those plants to be processed into energy so we can get these lights in this room. But in order for that coal to get over to those plants, it has to get into that truck and onto that belt, so men like Donzel are down in there, and men like me were down in there. My job, being new, my job all whole shift was to take a shovel, and the coal that fell off that belt, I put it back on that belt. I done that the whole shift. And you have to understand, this is low coal. This ain't like those high mines up in Pennsylvania. No, you're talking 28 inches to 36-inch high tunnels, no higher than a table. So you're crawling. And I always kept 1 foot under my backside, or you had to be on your knees all the time. And you say, did you get the head up? No. You worked with your head sideways. And naturally, the top of the roof, it was damp and wet, dusty, and coal would build up on the side of your head or side of it, or water would drip down your ear, down your clothes. And where it was so low, there was no way you could keep your back out of the top of it. All the time where you was working and moving, the time the shift was over, you was drenched, because you got lakes up above you. You got water, all that water dripping down. It's no dry place. Now, and once that shift was over, we was cleaning up in that room, and a few boys my age, we were flipping rocks at each other, just horseplay. And one of them, he took aim at Donzel. Flipped a rock over at him, and Donzel, he brushed it off his cap. He said, "Cut that out, quit it." He didn't like that horseplay too much. But we kept on and cleaning up. But I looked over at Donzel, and he kept brushing his cap, brushing dust off of it, and I thought I saw this little trickle of dust coming from the ceiling. Only the foreman, he hadn't seen it, and I thought I was just seeing things, so I went on back to working, and then I heard Donzel again. He's brushing his cap, and he said, "Cut that out, quit it." And I looked over at him, and there was this rock. It come out of the ceiling, and it plunked down on his cap, and it busted his cap light out, and all the lights went off. The foreman, he grabbed me by the shoulders, and he pulled me and him into the next room. There was this huge boom. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. And we sat up from where we'd landed. And we saw that whole ceiling had just collapsed in on top of that room. The whole shift. And I was the only one left, me and the foreman. Well, I remembered what Donzel had told me, that them rock falls, that they's deadly. But I couldn't help myself. I just ran over to that pile of rock, and I started pulling them off, hollering, "Donzel! Donzel!" And the foreman, he's a hollering for help, and me coughing and hacking. That coal dust is getting in my mouth and down my throat. Well, the others come, and we set to work. We started tunneling in, trying to find people. And I remembered that Donzel, he'd been by that continuous miner machine when his cap light had gone out. And so I took a couple of boys. We started tunneling out to where that was, but it took hours. About 10 hours later, that boy down that tunnel, we'd gone in shifts. That boy who was down there, he said he thought he could hear something. It was real weak, but it kind of sounded like breathing. And it was my turn to go in that tunnel. I went on through, and I picked up a rock, and I passed it back. And there he was. Donzel. He had his head pushed up against that miner machine. He'd found an air pocket in there. That's how he kept alive, but all the rest of him was just covered over in rock. Those arms, they was pinned underneath him. And I bent down. I was trying to reach his face, getting down to where he was, and as I got closer, I could see that he had vomited all over himself. And so I cleared that off away from his face, so he could breathe a little bit easier, but with those arms pinned underneath him, all that rock on him, he could just barely suck in the air. Well, we kept trying to take that coal off of him, and we got all of it off except for one leg. And then I started to see that same little trickle of dust start to come down. And this whole thing was just starting to rib roll back on top of him again. So we got boards, and we covered him over with boards, and we backed out of that tunnel, and me hollering, "We're not leaving you, Donzel, hold on." And then this other huge boom, and that whole thing just came on top of him again. We went back in. We tunneled through, took another hour, and we got all that rock off and pulled up those boards. We saw that they had saved him from that second fall. So we worked double quick. We got all that off of his leg, and I was tired by that point. I backed out of that tunnel. Another boy, he come in, and he grabbed Donzel by the belt and by the collar, and he just lifted him up out of that dark hole, and we started passing him one man to the next, and he come to me. I grabbed onto him, and as he passed by me, I saw that there wasn't a cut on him, but his clothes were soaked with blood. Where the pressure of being underneath all that rock for 14 hours, it had squeezed the blood out of his pores. Passed him on back, and we kept on going. We got 3 others out that day. But Buzzy and Dan and Luke, they was all crushed. We carried him out in pieces days later. But Donzel lived. He had 70-some injuries. And where those arms had been pinned underneath him, all those hours, 14 hours under that rock, it had cut off the circulation, and they had just rotted out from underneath him. The doctors, they cut off a piece at a time, trying to find something that was living. They left about 6 inches on each side, but he was alive. I went to visit him while he was in the hospital, and then over the next couple of years while he was recuperating at home. And I tell you something, this is true. He and I still go hunting together. That's true. Now I know I'm not much of a hunter, with my leg and my back, but the doctors, they made Donzel some good arms, prosthetic arms with metal hinges and a finger is just about right for that trigger. And we sit out on his back porch and we just wait for them crows to come along. At night of the accident, I went over, I sat down on my bed when I got home, I unzipped my jacket, took out that fossil. I looked at it, I thought about where it had come from. Hole in the earth that's fallen in on itself again, all that coal crushed in with blood and skin where those bodies had stained it. And you look at my knees now. Mine were after so many years of working, I got these little spots on them, black coal spots. You can't wash them out, can't get them out, can't get them out. And the doctors, they pulled me out of the mines a few years back. But I tell you the truth, I would give anything to go back down there again. The friendships that you meet down there make, and I was an archaeologist. Now, given the chance to live over again, I'd go back down every time. Now, I'm interested in their stories because of where I'm from, but also because their stories were so compelling and so often misunderstood by people outside of this region. Most people think of mining as an old guy with a pick and a shovel, not a mechanized industry that we're all connected to. So I felt an ethical compulsion to share their stories with others and to start a dialogue about how this story, as an artistic performance, connects outward with the wider social and economic issues that impact all of us. You may have access to those kinds of stories in your history or your culture that you want to share, stories that start a dialogue about an issue that matters to you. It's important if you're telling a story that someone else has told you their story, you need to get their permission to tell their story. And you want to make sure that you're telling the story that they want to tell, not turning the story into something that serves your own motives, but telling it in such a way that honors that person's perspective. Now, in general, try to locate credible sources, people or story versions that can give you differing but reliable perspectives. Now, for instance, this story is based on an interview that was featured in a government-sponsored mining training video. It's in public domain. And I balanced that film perspective with interviews that I did with over 20 different contemporary miners, and I had their permission to tell their stories. They knew how these stories would be used. In seeking out multiple sources, you're seeking multiple viewpoints. And this will help you develop your characters within the story, because every character has the potential to be the hero or the villain, depending on your point of view. So you're fact-checking in big ways and in small ways, making sure the details are accurate in the story. Details matter. And paying attention to these details is important, because if you get a date wrong in your story, you can bet someone in your audience will recognize it. And that misstep, it's not just that it's embarrassing, it distances your audience from experiencing the story. It's a distraction. So the details of context are also crucial when you're getting to know your story. Because after all, one of the first questions you usually ask a stranger when you first get to know them is, well, where are you from? Place shapes us. So pay attention to where you are at any given moment in the story. Remember the qualities of oral thought, remaining close to the life world, with an emphasis on situated actions and specific locations. Cultural context is important, and as we'll see later, nearly every culture has a Cinderella story. But there are cultural reasons why one story features a woolen bootie and another story features a glass slipper. So George Buchanan is a folktale, and the miner's story is an ethnographic story. It's based on oral histories. Now these are all genres of stories that you can tell. So let's outline some of these different genres. Most of the time, the stories we tell come from our personal experience or from the immediate world around us. Most of these are personal stories or personal narratives, those stories that you tell about yourself, and to other people. Yes, you tell stories to yourself. As we see in this triangle, stories always have an audience, and you are always the first audience for your stories. We are constantly talking to ourselves. And we test out stories first on ourselves to decide if the story is worth remembering, worth repeating. So personal stories are about you and your experiences. They have meaning first to you and then to your audience. We have family stories, stories that your family has passed down to you about your heritage, and stories about your family members that members may tell on one another. There's usually a pecking order of who gets to tell stories on another person. It's like we talked about in our first lecture with the hand story, and then the story of Aunt Maid, the old maid. Now, the sources of these kinds of stories, the personal stories, the family stories, you get these stories from yourself and from family members. Now, your family may tell ghost stories. Ghosts in your family, I have a few, or ghost stories about your region. Some ghost stories are part of a wider cultural experience and story base. They're shared by groups of people. For instance, Japanese ghost stories that have inspired many films. Folk tales are another kind of cultural story. Now, these are tales that are told by the folk of a particular culture or region or a particular part of the world. And they're usually localized. So you'll hear about Scottish folk tales, such as George Buchanan, or African folk tales, such as stories about Anansi, the spider. Now, in these stories, we can see the dominant values and cultural values of that region coming through. So, in the American folktale Johnny Appleseed, the main character, he plants and he harvests. He even lays claim to the land in this way, planting seeds all over the land. Now, arguably, these were some of the early American settlers' values. Now, we generally understand that the folk stories aren't actually true. There may never have been a person, Johnny Appleseed, although that's an interesting story. But folk tales still reveal something about a culture, either explicitly or implicitly, although the culture itself may have changed and adapted away from those values over time. Folk tales tell about the folk. There's an excellent online compendium of folk tales. It's been arranged by type and by topics. It was done by D.L. Ashleyman at the University of Pittsburgh. And these stories are arranged topically according to a cross-cultural referencing system that was created by the folklorists Arne and Thompson. So you can look up on this database, you can look up stories under headings such as bald stories, folktales about hairless men, and stories about humans with animal ears and horns. All of these are tale types and topics. Another source is your library's 398.2 section. 398.2 is sometimes called the storytelling section among storytellers because it's this section that houses the written records of stories that, on the whole, originated in the oral tradition. Another great resource is the Pantheon collection. It's called the Pantheon Fairy Tale and Folklore Library. And it's a good idea to veer towards scholarly presses for folktale collections, such as the Oxford collections, because these versions provide cultural context and they've been vetted for cultural accuracy or fidelity to the oral versions of stories, rather than a literary prettying up of oral stories. The Victorians were famous for this. August House is another publishing company that specializes in the dissemination of the work of professional storytellers, and it's a great resource for reading and for listening to professional storytellers at the top of their craft. But as with any other source, make sure you're crafting your own versions of stories from multiple sources and putting them into your own words, because plagiarizing a professional storyteller's story is as much a sin as academic plagiarism. Now, in these sources, you'll find folk tales and also fairy tales or wonder tales, such as Snow White or Sleeping Beauty. They're fairy tales because some magical help comes into the story and aids or tries to harm the characters in the story. And then there are sacred stories and myths. They deal with gods and mortals and the big questions, such as, why am I here? How did I come to be? You may have your own stories from your own faith tradition, your own sacred stories. Now, just a note, we tend to talk about ancient myths such as Greek mythology or Roman mythology, and we tend to use the term mythology to separate our own belief system as sacred stories from the just stories of other cultures. It's important to remember that other people's myths are just as sacred to them as your own sacred stories are for you. Some sources for finding myths are your own sacred texts and the sacred texts of other world religions. And D.L. Ashliman's website also contains myths, as well as another very good book, Josefa Sherman's book, Mythology for Storytellers. Legends are another great genre. Legends may or may not be true. And there are old legends, such as the legend of Sleepy Hollow, about that poor teacher, Ichabod Crane, who happens to cross the path of the headless rider on that lonely road, and he was never heard from again. You may have heard urban legends when you were a kid at camp, like the story called The Hook. It's one of my favorites. It's that story about the kids who are out necking in the boys' car at make-out point, and then the girl, she keeps putting the guy off, and he grabs for her, and she puts him off until finally he's so frustrated that he just lays on the gas pedal and speeds home. And on the way home, they hear on the radio that a murderer is on the loose right out from where they were making out. And the murderer has a hook for a hand. And when the boy, he drives that girl home, and he comes around to the car to let the girl out at her house, he sees a hook still dangling from the door handle. Dun, dun, dun. And of course, the lesson of that story is that they got away just before the murderer opened the car door and would have slashed them. And by implication, it was the girl putting the guy off from his sexual advances that got them away just in the nick of time. And there's the model for the stereotypical young American couple. The guy tries to get as far as he can, and the girl is supposed to put him off. And if she doesn't put him off, the hook will get them both. So there are values that these legends carry with them. And we're seeing that stories do a lot of work in cultures to communicate values. Some good sources for urban legends are Jan van Bruinven's works, her books, or just volunteer as a leader at any Girl Scout or Boy Scout camp out. You'll hear plenty of these. There are tall tales with characters that are blown way out of proportion. They have superhuman strength that's attributed to an ordinary person. And of course, the joy in these stories is that the person telling them absolutely believes that the story is true. Yes, I really did catch a fish this big. Now, Bill Lepp specializes in tall tales or liars stories. They're fictions, like moose tipping. But they sound so real that you want to believe that they're true. Tall tales. Now, the last one I'll mention are fables, such as Aesop's fables, stories that teach a moral lesson at the end. And usually these are short stories with anthropomorphic characters, animals that take on human qualities. So the wise owl, the clever fox. But there's usually always a clear lesson that's tied to the story and stated directly. So two crows work together to drop pebbles into a jar of water until they can reach the water with their beaks and they both can drink. A clever crow will never grow thirsty. Now, depending on your background and your experiences, you've been exposed to one or a number of these genres. And there are other genres you may not be as familiar with. And this takes us back to the storytelling triangle in some interesting and important ways, because there are stories that press in on us due to our cultural context. So the family stories that you grew up with, the childhood fairy tales that you heard, and depending on what country that you grew up in, you'd hear different stories. So even the stories that your peers tell you, even stories that you're exposed to because you stumble on them. So that person you didn't expect to run into, but all of a sudden you hear his story or her story, and you're pulled into this whole other world. Now, for example, I was shopping one day in the grocery store. And at this time, it was right after our baby was born. And a relative was watching the baby, so I had a few precious seconds on my own to stock our pantry. And so as I rushed from aisle to aisle, this older man started talking to me. And you know how this is. It's the person who just needs to talk with someone, and you just happen to be that person they've trapped into a conversation. And that's how I thought of it at first. I was stuck there. And when I didn't really have a lot of time to waste. But as he talked, he told me about how he had just lost his wife. And then I stopped, and I put my own day aside for a second, and I asked him about her. And he said, I only had 49 years with her. And for the rest of that day, and whenever I think about that story, I think about how he phrased that. I only had 49 years with her. Now that's a love story. So we're exposed to stories based on our family background, our cultural background, our peers, even the grocery store we happen to go to. And if you look at the storytelling triangle, here's this story pressing towards you. We're inundated with specific stories based on the specific context of our lives. And then there are stories that we've sought out because they weren't a part of our background. So you may have traveled and learned about cultures that are different from your own. Travel is a wonderful way to learn new stories. And isn't that what draws us to travel, to explore, to learn, to expand? You may have sought out education that expanded the stories you knew. And you've chosen and read certain books, and you watch movies and TV programs that tell stories. So back to the storytelling triangle, at the same time as certain stories press in on us, here's our own context propelling us towards other stories. And the context surrounding us and surrounding the stories we seek out are all a part of how we know the stories that we know. So the stories we know and choose to tell, there are really a lot of factors that weigh on these choices. And there is a context that weighs on your audience as well. This context impacts how your audience will interpret and respond to your story. It impacts if they're even ready to listen to you in the first place. See, there's a lot going on in the storytelling dynamic than we give it credit for. So in our next lecture, we'll talk about how your relationship with your audience affects the stories that you tell.